thank you very much to all the organisers for inviting me here to share some of my experiences from Australia. The histories of our countries are different, but we can also learn things from one another. And I would like to begin with a small story that illustrates a point that Dr. Farid made about how objects, museums don't have all the information about objects. So could I have the slide, please? So some of my ancestors were Tasmanian Aboriginal people, and I grew up in Tasmania. And the woman you see recording is my grandmother's grandmother. And she's the only Tasmanian Aboriginal person who ever recorded Tasmanian Aboriginal songs. Yeah. And my first job in a museum was in Melbourne in the 1980s. And there were some baskets from Tasmania sitting in the museum in Melbourne, this basket. And the museum records only had that someone, the wife of someone, had given this to the museum 40 years before. But when I was speaking to one of my elderly relatives in Tasmania, she said she had a basket made by my ancestor Fanny Smith and had given it to the schools inspector, Mr. Meston, whose wife had given it to the museum in Melbourne. So through the oral history in my family, I was able to find out that who made that basket because the museum had no records. So it's so important that museums are full of objects where the information is incomplete, and the work of provenance is really important to get the community knowledge and mix that with any written records to try and find out where objects come from. Next slide, please. So just very briefly, in terms of the history of repatriation in Australia, this really began in the 1970s with people from Tasmania, and the first repatriations were not from overseas museums, but from museums within Australia, within Tasmania, because the Tasmanian Museum put a skeleton of one of our ancestors on display in the museum for many years, and it took decades to fight to return the skeleton of the woman Truganini to the community. So repatriation in Australia is also about getting objects back from museums within Australia as opposed to museums overseas, and Aboriginal collections are today held in many countries, not only in Britain, but Germany, France, Japan, Italy, United States. And so from the 1990s, the Australian government began to support state museums to help return some human remains and objects. And then from about 2012, I'll be speaking briefly about some projects involving Australian universities, museums, and museums overseas, such as the British Museum, to help get more information about collections so people would understand what is in collections overseas and what is held in Australia. And then from 2018, the Australian government has been giving some money to an organisation called IATSIS, the Australian Institute for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, to support return from overseas. But some communities would prefer to do their own research independently, and other people are happy for IATSIS to work with them, so that each community has different ways of working. But in terms of the projects I've been on, and I'll just share a little bit today, some of the projects have been looking at where are collections all in the UK, so Australia-wide projects. A project where are all the objects that came from the Sydney region. An object that was lost, provenance of a single object, looking at natural history and cultural collections, and how do we link objects to people, and looking at community consultation. So next slide, please, engaging objects. This was a 4-year project with the National University in Canberra, the National Museum of Australia and the British Museum, and through the joint work, many Aboriginal people were able to come to London to look at things in collections, And many of the curators at the National Museum in Canberra spent time talking to many communities in Australia about what was in the British Museum and getting information packs to communities. So the National Museum in Canberra gave out information packs about a lot of things in collections in London, and also the project helped support Aboriginal people visit London to look at more objects in the museum. And as part of this project, there was an exhibition put on in London about the Aboriginal collections, and there were some significant visitors and speakers, including artists, Simon Hogan, and June Oscar, a woman from Western Australia, who spoke at the opening of the exhibitions and telling people directly in London about the importance of these objects. Next, please. And so there was 3 exhibitions resulted. The first exhibition was in London, and then many of the objects from the British Museum were sent to Canberra for an exhibition to let more people in Australia know what was in the collection. And then thirdly, with the help of the Western Australian Museum, the Museum of the Great Southern in Western Australia also borrowed objects so it could go back and be exhibited right in the community where those objects came from, because the people in Albany couldn't get to Canberra to see objects. So with the cooperation of the different national museums and state museums, the objects went back and were exhibited in the place where they came from. And while some people obviously said, these are only here on loan, that's true. But the community wanted to know what these objects were and see them and use them to regenerate knowledge while other discussions happened. As a result of that project, next slide please, the National Museum of Australia assisted with a program that is ongoing. So every 2 years, a group of 6 emerging Aboriginal curators are selected from across Australia, and the National Museum of Australia arranges a training program for about 6 weeks, where the curators from different communities spend 2 weeks in Canberra, go back to their communities. Then they go visit museums in London, New Zealand and other places, and then they go back to Canberra again and return knowledge to their community. And I was in London in 2019, and it was great seeing these young emerging museum curators, some living in remote communities, visiting London, seeing collections, taking knowledge back to their community, and word of mouth was very important. This next slide, please. Some of you would know that only in April this year, the University of Cambridge at Trinity College returned to Australia these spears collected by Captain Cook in 1770. And this was a private negotiation between that La Perouse community in Sydney and Trinity College, Cambridge. This happened because of the respectful relationships that the community built up with Trinity College. Trinity College at Cambridge doesn't have the same legislation as the National Museums in Britain, so it was easier to return objects. And because the records were very clear, it was known what place and what day these spears were collected and where they were collected from. So this is a rare case where all the information is very complete, and that's unusual. Next slide, please. And this is quite a contentious object in the British Museum and has been the subject of much media attention because one community member in Australia suggests that his ancestor was on the beach when Captain Cook landed in 1770 and that he made this shield and it was collected by Captain Cook in 1770. Next slide, please. Rodney Cook, he wanted this shield to come back to Australia because he said it was made by his ancestor and collected by Cook. However, while it is one of the oldest shields in the British Museum and from Australia, there is some doubt whether or not it was collected by Captain Cook or not. And so the community associated with the spears, they asked the British Museum to do more research on the shield. And so we had a workshop in London inviting members of the community, some scientists and others to look at, and next slide please, is the shield in the British Museum the same as this shield that was drawn in 1771 in London? And some archaeologists believed that because the shield in the British Museum was made of red mangrove that doesn't grow in Sydney, it must have been traded from further north. However, if the shield was not collected in 1770, but collected after British colonisation in 1788, and perhaps collected between 1788 and say 1820, there are many other ways the shield could have got to London rather than through collected by Captain Cook. So there's still debate about the shield. However, asking questions about these objects mean people start researching more and want to know more, and that's a good thing. And so the community in Sydney, next slide, they wanted the researchers to work with them to find out more about objects from early Sydney. And these are some members of the community looking at objects in Cambridge and in London. And going to London, visiting the institutions, meeting the museum directors and curators is a very important part of the relationship building. And then with colleagues at the Australian National University, next slide please, we got funding to do a project looking at where were all the earliest objects collected from Sydney, because there wasn't a museum established in Sydney until 1826. So there was a whole period before 1826 where objects collected in Sydney went back to Britain, and there are very few objects, early objects from the Sydney region remaining in Australia. So in order to try and find where were the earliest objects collected, next slide please, we looked to some of the very detailed drawings that were done by artists in Sydney in the 1790s who drew in fine detail what some of the early objects looked like. And because these are so rare, not many people are familiar with these specific types of objects. And because the earliest objects sent to Britain often have very little documentation or paperwork, but when we began to, with a colleague, and I was in London, we began to look at collections that just said Australia, objects that say Australia. And then, next slide please, we found in collections, by comparison of the early drawings to objects in collections that just say Australia, we then began to identify many, many objects that we believe came from the Greater Sydney region because they are so similar to the objects in the drawing, because the drawings are very precise. For example, next slide please. Yes, these are very, very similar objects. So the one on the left was drawn by an artist, and then we found sitting in the British Museum, it just said Australia, was this club. And we think they're so similar, this club must come from the Greater Sydney region. And then, next slide please. This is an example of some provenance research I did last year, and the work of provenance research is being made more easy today because there are more libraries and archives who are digitising their research material. So in the middle is what has written on it a native paddle, and none of these are known to exist from Sydney. We didn't think any were collected, but then when I began to look more carefully, where did this native paddle come from? Because in the British Museum, the documentation said it was purchased from the Crosswaite Museum in Keswick in 1870, and that museum is in the far north of England. and I didn't know anything about that museum. And the spade looked different the paddle looked different to some of the ones in the illustrations. But then when I looked into the archives of the Crosthwaite Museum, I found out that there was a catalogue of that museum made in 1826. It was a family museum established by an East India Company officer in the 1780s. And they did a catalogue, and in that catalogue in 1826, and it says at top right, that Captain George A. King, and that's actually a misspelling, he collected from Botany Bay, New South Wales, a sword, a shield, a paddle, a hatchet, etc. So we know that this paddle was in that museum in the 1820s, and then when the museum was sold by a descendant of the family in the 1870s, at bottom left, the word paddle appears in the sale catalogue in 1872, and next slide please, sorry. On the sales catalogue it has an Australian digging stick. So that was the person who was buying things for the British Museum. So over the years, the name of the person who donated it was wrong. The name of the object was wrong. So it's really important to go back and check. And so this Captain George A. King, whose name was in the catalogue in 1826. Next slide, please. I found out that that was in fact a Captain George Aitken, and he had come to Sydney in 1789, and he was only there for 5 weeks. So we understand now that the paddle was collected in Sydney in 1789 by tracing back all these things. And then here's an example. Next slide, please. This was the drawing done by the Polynesian navigator Tupaia in 1770 of the types of paddles that were in use then. So by using artist drawings and documentation, you can trace some of these objects back. Just a few quick examples. The next one. This shield in the British Museum, that travelled through many hands, and we think it was this one drawn over here in an illustration in about 1815. And then we think through diaries of various people that was actually collected in Sydney at Port Jackson in 1788. Next slide, please. So why do all this work? Well, the whole point of this is to try and help communities find out where their objects are, because that's the most common question. Where are all the objects relating to my community? And so through the funding of this project, the community selected 30 of the objects from different museums in Britain that they wanted to see come back to Sydney initially on exhibition. So the State Library of New South Wales helped. And next slide, please. This exhibition was held in 2024 with these early Sydney objects being returned to Sydney, initially on loan, but the community has time to look at them. And because they come from a great area, many Aboriginal groups would have ties with these. Moving on, this is an example of a single object from Tasmania. There's a container at the bottom left made out of kelp, and we were able to trace, working with our colleagues at the Musée de Quai Branly in Paris, that it existed. It was collected in Tasmania in 1793. It was illustrated in a sales catalogue in Paris in 1828. And then in 2019, I found a drawing of it in an archive in Manchester when I was doing my family history. And that drawing was done in the 1890s. So I knew it still existed in the 1890s. And so this object had become lost in France. So I asked my colleagues at the museum in Paris, it must be somewhere in your collections. And they had no records of an object from Tasmania or an object made from kelp. But they looked for it. And then, as often happens by chance, next slide please. when they were working in the African collections at the Musée de Gaye Sculthorpe, they came across it as an unprovenance object from Africa. And they were able to trace at various times it had been labelled as coming from New Zealand. It had been made of bark, it had been made of leather, so it had the wrong country, the wrong material, but because of the earliest illustrations, we knew it was the one collected in Tasmania in 1793. Next slide, please. And so the Musée de Gaye Sculthorpe and members of the community in Tasmania and the British Museum looked at this object in Paris. We had a workshop with one kelp container in the British Museum and a kelp container found at a second-hand shop in Canberra to try and find out more about kelp containers. And the scientists at the Natural History Museum were able to use infrared to say that the kelp container in Paris was the same sort of kelp as the naturalists collected on that same voyage. So we're able to use the scientific technique to understand what it was. And then in 2023, next slide please, the French curators brought this object out where it's still on display in the museum in Hobart. And it's the only one in the world. The community, the French, to the French it's very significant, to Tasmanian Aboriginal people it's very significant. I think eventually it will go back to Paris, but Tasmanian Aboriginal people have had it for some time and would like to have a longer term arrangement. Next slide please. This is an example of the exhibition I mentioned in Albany that was put on by the Western Australian Museum, working with a local community with some objects at the British Museum. And that community have continued to research their own collections with a researcher from Deakin, Tiffany Shellham. Next slide, please. And they're very interested not only in cultural objects, but items of natural history, because this series of drawings was done of fish that are in, the fish were collected in Albany in the 1840s, and the fish were given to the Natural History Museum in London and in Scotland, and the person who collected them did these drawings, and on some of the fish you can see some of the spear holes, and it also has some of the names of the people who caught the fish, and the drawings also have language on them that helps in language revival. And next slide, please. Last year, they went to the Natural History Museum and have been re-engaging with this collection, and these will probably come out on loan to Albany in the coming years. Next slide, please. This one is an example of provenance research from a whole region in Central Australia, and my colleague Jason Gibson was funded for a year to go and talk to a whole group of senior men about what should happen to unprovenance objects from Central Australia. So it's time-consuming and it's slow work, but the men were able to say that they'd like to have these objects returned to Central Australia. Next slide, please. Through the research with communities, we published a book with the locations all around England of where Aboriginal objects are, so people can use the book to and see more references to where they can do more research. Next slide. And through looking at the collections that are online, people can do research, so that helps. Next slide. And through publications about what is in collections, that helps other people do more research, because it's an ongoing process. So just to summarise, I've just got a few small points to make. The summary regarding Australian issues. The government emphasis in Australia is on returning ancestral remains plus secret sacred objects. There are many different government agencies involved, and this sometimes can be confusing for communities and overseas museums. Sometimes objects get returned, but most of the objects being returned are ones where the documentation is very clear. So many objects don't get returned because more research needs to be done. There is very little repatriation of objects within Australian museums to other countries, or from within Australian museums to local communities. And finally, just like to end with a couple of points. I think in all these discussions, while museums in Europe are worried about how they should do provenance research, colonial era objects, and they start looking at their collections, but in my view, perhaps the first thing to do is to actually start talking to communities about what communities actually want. So the communities help set the priorities about what should be researched, how that should be researched. So starting with the community, not with the collections. Secondly, just emphasising if there are images or information online that can help people. Some communities want more help to have local museums in their communities, so objects can be kept locally. And it's not always easy to identify the right communities for the right objects, because sometimes the information is only very general and the objects come from a general region. So it takes time, like the Central Australian example, to actually work carefully with a whole range of people to work out what should be done. So it's easier if the documentation is clear. So I would like to end there with just as a general presentation of some of the things that have been happening in Australia, which I hope might be of interest to you. And I know you have different issues, but some might be the same here. Thank you.